Racist cops robbed a federal judge of $2,000. What happened 5 minutes later shocked the world. In a world where skin color can be treated like a crime, a rainy night and an old car were enough to ignite a storm called prejudice. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. At exactly 11:54 p.m., the October rain poured over Old Gulf Road, as if trying to wash away every trace of the day. This was Gladwin, a neighborhood in Pennsylvania known for its unmatched tranquility, where each mansion sat behind rows of maple trees and was worth no less than $4 million, and the soft yellow glow from the windows belonged only to the elite. Surgeons, corporate CEOs, or hand-picked politicians aged like fine wine. On that deserted stretch of road, a silver 1998 Lexus LS 400 looked woefully out of place, like a low note in the symphony of Range Rovers, Mercedes GLSs, and Porsche Cayennes neatly parked in stone-paved driveways. Behind the wheel sat a black man, around 60 years old. His tweed coat was faded, the white collar of his shirt peeking out beneath worn fabric, and his hands rested neatly on the steering wheel. His name was Connell Chapman, and while anyone passing by might mistake him for a cab driver on break, within him lived a life steeped in law, principle, and quiet observation. He wasn't afraid, but he knew it as someone who'd read the script before ever being invited on stage. His skin color, the type of car he drove, an address that didn't match Gladwin's zip code. These weren't coincidences. They were a sentence already written, just waiting for someone in power to carry it out. In the rearview mirror, red and blue lights flickered, casting his face in and out of darkness, like a portrait that never came into focus because no one ever wanted to see it whole. Then it came. A voice from the police loudspeaker hit the night like a punch. "Step out of the car now. What do you think you're doing here at this hour?" Connell let out a quiet sigh. Not one of panic, but the sigh of someone who knew this play too well, but had never been allowed to forget his role. He didn't move, just looked straight ahead, hands still where they had always been. From behind, two figures emerged from the patrol car. The first, a large man with a swagger that suggested the street belonged to him. His name was Douglas Fisher, a patrol officer with nearly 15 years on the job and not a single reprimand to his name, partly because his report book was always clean, and partly because those he mistreated never had the power to speak up. Beside him, a younger officer, Officer Gibson, followed slowly. His uniform was still crisp, his steps hesitant, eyes scanning the surroundings as if to confirm this was happening. Gibson had studied justice, learned about serving the community, but tonight, those ideals felt like luxuries. Fisher strode up to the car, no permission asked, no need for checks. He rapped his gloved hand on the window 3 times, hard. It wasn't to alert, it was to declare, "I have authority." Connell lowered the window with the old electric switch, the motor groaning softly. Cold air swept in, carrying the smell of rain and damp earth. Fisher looked Connell up and down like selecting merchandise in a store. Horn-rimmed glasses, worn coat, calm eyes. He sneered. "A junk car like this, you think it fits in around here?" The voice was soaked in sarcasm, contempt, and the certainty that he'd never have to answer for it. Gibson, standing behind, clenched his fists, but said nothing. Fresh out of the academy for just 2 years, he'd never been assigned to patrol an upscale neighborhood, where even a face that didn't fit the scenery could be treated like a felony. That night, the rain didn't let up. But no one knew. The real storm hadn't even begun. Connell Chapman maintained a calm gaze, but inside him, a familiar sensation stirred, one that had followed him since his early days, clerking at a federal court, where he was the only black candidate among 42 Harvard Law graduates in 1987. He had once stood in the center of suspicion, interrogated as if his intellect were a deception rather than the product of 3 decades of relentless mental labor. But nowhere, never, had he seen the ideals he once learned about community policing so brazenly betrayed. Officer Douglas Fisher stood there, hand resting lightly on his gun, as if ready to draw at any moment, not because there was danger, but because he believed he could manufacture danger from anyone who didn't fit his view of the world. The rain continued to fall on his black uniform coat, but in Fisher's eyes, Connell Chapman wasn't a citizen. He was a problem. "Your friend lives here? What's his name? What's the house number?" Fisher barked, eyes cold like forged steel. Connell turned his head slightly, looking into those eyes without a hint of fear. "I just left a friend's home. Where I've been and where I'm going is irrelevant to the reason for this stop." His voice wasn't loud, but each word rang with the clarity of a courtroom verdict. Fisher smirked. "Oh, you want to play lawyer, huh? Fine. Show me the car registration." Connell slowly reached for his wallet. Every motion was deliberate, not rushed, not open to misinterpretation, because he knew that even a misplaced twitch could become a tragedy. The officer had a gun, and the law, in the hands of men like Fisher, was something that could be twisted like scrap metal. Fisher took the driver's license, glanced over the name. Connell Augustus Chapman, a name that carried weight among anyone who had ever studied law in the eastern United States. The address said Villanova, an affluent area, yet still wrong, because the driver of this old Lexus was a black man. "Connell Augustus Chapman," Fisher repeated, dragging the syllables like he was reciting lines in a play. "Sounds like a character from an old movie. Don't tell me you're a lawyer?" Connell gave a faint smile. "I work for the government." Fisher burst out laughing, his voice coarse with a mix of cigarettes and condescension. "The government? What, janitor at City Hall? Or you deliver mail in Villanova?" Connell didn't react. He'd heard that kind of mockery before, from white students who thought they were superior, from petty bureaucrats who clung to their titles. His calmness wasn't passivity. It was the practiced choice of someone who recognized every trap being laid. Behind them, Officer Gibson watched in silence. He was a second-generation Asian American. His parents owned a small dry cleaning shop in Springfield and had put 3 kids through college. Gibson had earned an A in law and community ethics at the academy, but now he stood in a situation no textbook had prepared him for. What to do when your superior is wrong right in front of you, and the victim looks more like a college professor than a threat. Gibson saw the creases on Connell's forehead, saw how he controlled his breath, slow, steady, as though regulating his heartbeat to avoid drowning in anger. In his mind, he pictured his old sociology professor, same round glasses, same tweed jacket, the only person of color in the department, and who, too, had once been pulled over for driving a car that didn't match the neighborhood. Fisher noticed none of this. He was consumed by the smugness rising in his eyes. He didn't realize that, while he laughed, thinking he had put a loud black man in his place, he was facing a federal judge who had delivered over 3,200 rulings in 22 years and authored 147 legal opinions cited by the Supreme Court. But tonight, on that dark stretch of road, all of it was erased by one thing alone: the color of his skin. And in Fisher's eyes, Connell Chapman wasn't the law. He was someone who needed to be taught a lesson, a mistake, the cost of which Fisher could not yet begin to imagine. The line between power and abuse is not always clear. But on that rainy night on Old Gulf Street, when a voice full of hostility thundered, "Get out of the car, now!" That line was mercilessly erased. Connell Chapman didn't move. He knew he wasn't legally obligated to step out of the vehicle, not unless there was a lawful reason, defined by clear standards under U.S. law. And he also knew that if he complied without speaking up, he would be silently permitting the other man to bend the law under the guise of official duty. "Officer," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Under the ruling in Pennsylvania v. Mims, you do have the authority to ask me to exit the vehicle to ensure safety during a lawful stop. But Terry v. Ohio states that to search, you must have reasonable suspicion that I am armed or dangerous. I meet neither of those criteria." Fisher froze for a few seconds, not because he was convinced, but because he couldn't stand the fact that a black suspect was quoting the law like a judge, as if Connell's fingers, which had once flipped through thousands of legal case files, were now peeling away the false layers of power Fisher had wrapped himself in. "Shut up, you self-appointed lawyer," Fisher barked, yanking the car door handle and dragging Connell out with brute force. Though caught off guard, Connell didn't resist. To him, there was no victory in fighting back against someone who had already chosen to wield authority as a weapon. Fisher shoved him against the car. A dull thud echoed as Connell's shoulder collided with the cold metal body of the Lexus, no longer a symbol of luxury, but now the evidence of a brutal act unfolding in the heart of so-called civilized America. Rain clung to the car windows. Connell's shirt clung to his back, soaked. His glasses were splattered with cold droplets. But inside him, nothing wavered. Not a single curse. Not a groan. Only a gaze like a scalpel, cutting straight into the face of the man who presumed himself the master. "Hands on the roof!" Fisher growled like a beast provoked. Connell complied, not out of fear, but with full awareness. His every move was being recorded by Gibson's body cam. Gibson, who still stood silently behind, like a shadow torn between ethics and professional loyalty. A sharp click echoed. The metal handcuffs did not merely bind the wrists of a 60-year-old man. They locked away the promise of democracy and equality. In Fisher's hands, the cuffs didn't represent law and order. They were a symbol of legalized insult, sanctified by the badge. Connell inhaled sharply as the steel bit into his wrists. Fisher tightened them beyond what was necessary, as if trying to crush the dignified silence of the man before him. "You're crossing a line you can't come back from," Connell said, his voice not loud, but as cold as a blade. It wasn't a threat. It was the prognosis of someone who understood the consequences with chilling clarity. Fisher merely sneered. To him, tonight was just another lesson, another round of restoring order in a world he believed had been thrown into chaos by people like Chapman. But what he didn't know was that in his grip was not just the wrist of an ordinary man, but the wrist of a living legal icon, someone once invited as the keynote speaker at the National Conference on Judicial Reform, someone who had lectured at Columbia about police overreach. And tonight, he had mistaken this man for someone beneath him. Without realizing, he had touched the very nerve center of a system that was about to crush him in return. As for Officer Gibson, still standing there, rain-soaked and heavy-hearted, he knew everything happening before him was wrong. So wrong it made his chest ache. But what words could stop it? And did he have the courage to break the silence that this profession had grown far too used to? The answer was drawing closer with every passing second, and the real storm had only just begun. The rain kept falling steadily, as if trying to wash away all evidence. But what was about to happen would leave a mark deeper than any bloodstain on Connell Chapman's wrists. Forced to face the car, his hands cuffed behind his back, his coat soaked through, raindrops trickling down the collar onto his neck, Connell stood still. Fisher stood right behind him, rough, indifferent, beginning the search as though he were stripping away a man's dignity. The pungent scent of gunpowder clung to Fisher's leather gloves as they moved methodically over Connell's body, from underarms to hips, from jacket sides to thighs, finally pausing at the inner pocket of his coat. His fingers hesitated when they touched a soft, thick object, a smooth brown leather wallet, the kind people gift each other on anniversaries, not to flaunt. Fisher pulled out the wallet and snapped it open right in front of Connell's eyes, as if anticipating a moment of triumph. He smirked. Inside was a thick stack of neatly folded bills, 20 crisp $100 bills, clean, flat, still smelling of fresh ink. $2,000, enough to support a middle-class family for a month in this state, yet more than enough to brand a black man as a drug suspect in the eyes of someone like Fisher. "Gibson," he bellowed, raising the stack of money like a trophy wrested from a corpse. "You see this? This is the kind of clean-cut citizen you trust? $2,000 in cash? That's a damn drug deal." Gibson stood 2 meters away, rain hammering down on his police cap. He didn't answer. A heavy blow had just struck his chest from the inside. He knew perfectly well. There's no law against carrying cash, and had it been a white man in an Armani suit with the same amount in his pocket, Fisher probably would have addressed him as Sir and waved him on. But this time it was Connell Chapman, black, in an old car, confident demeanor, and that was enough for a conviction. Connell didn't argue. He didn't need to. He just watched. His eyes followed Fisher's every move. And then he saw the worst happen. Fisher, without glancing at his body camera, without reading out any procedure, without calling for a witness, shoved the stack of cash straight into the left breast pocket of his waterproof jacket. No evidence bag, no seal, no paperwork, and absolutely no justification. The leather wallet, now just an empty shell, was tossed onto the hood like garbage. Its soft thud against the metal sounded like a sentence. Dignity revoked, no courtroom required. Connell drew in a deep breath, not from anger, but because he knew this was the point of no return. Throughout his career, he had ruled in more than 3,000 lawsuits, authored theses on police violations of civil rights. Yet never had he imagined becoming the central figure in a blatant robbery on the street, committed by a man with a name tag, a badge, and a government-issued firearm. Fisher turned back, his eyes gleaming with smug satisfaction. "I'll be holding this money as evidence, and you, my friend," he said, biting off each word, "are coming for a little ride to the station." No one recorded that act. No one objected. No one stood up for him, only the rain. And Officer Gibson, clenching his jaw as if his insides were being torn apart, piece by piece. He had once believed police were the guardians of truth. But now, the truth was wrapped up in a jacket pocket, hidden like stolen goods, by the very person entrusted to enforce the law. And deep within, Gibson knew. If he didn't act soon, then his name would be no different from that wallet. Hollow, worthless, abandoned in the rain, while the rain kept falling steadily on Connell Chapman's bowed head and cuffed shoulders. The Pennsylvania night seemed to tighten, holding its breath in a silence that suffocated. No one spoke. No one moved. The cold of the metal and the weight of humiliation mingled, settling deep into every joint of the 60-year-old man. But within him, there was no fear, only calculation and readiness. He raised his head, looked at Fisher, and calmly requested, "I want to make a phone call. By law, I have that right." Fisher burst into laughter, a sharp, sneering chuckle full of scorn and mockery. "Oh, calling your lawyer? Or maybe Obama? Go ahead, I've got time for a comedy show." Without argument, Connell recited a string of numbers. 10 digits, no hesitation, no mistakes. Fisher took Connell's phone. An old iPhone flecked with raindrops, and ran his thick fingers over the screen, entering the number as spoken. "Let's see if you can get God on the line," Fisher scoffed, then hit the call button and put it on speaker. The line rang. Once. Twice. Then, a voice came through. Clear, powerful, cold as a blade drawn from its sheath. "Hello. This is Alexander Sterling." Gibson jolted. His ears burned. Sterling? That name wasn't unfamiliar to anyone in the justice system. He was the Attorney General of Pennsylvania, the man who had rocked the entire state with a sweeping crackdown on 12 police departments for abuse of power in just 8 months. A political force known for his iron fist against any wrongdoing, regardless of rank, race, or affiliation. Fisher raised an eyebrow, hesitated briefly, but still forced a smile. Oh, our dear friend. On the other end, Connell's tone changed. No longer the calm man handcuffed in the rain. His voice deepened, each word deliberate and clear. "Bob, it's me, Connell. I'm handcuffed, standing in the rain on Old Gulf Road. Officer Douglas Fisher has just unlawfully confiscated $2,000 in cash from me without any report, no recording, and is threatening to arrest me without cause." 3 seconds of silence. 3 seconds, like the countdown of a bomb about to detonate. The wind picked up. Fisher felt his chest tighten, though he didn't yet understand why. Gibson stood frozen, eyes locked on the speakerphone, as if it were the mouth of hell about to burst open. And then... "What?" The voice on the line roared like thunder, shattering the air. The volume made Fisher instinctively step back. This was no longer a phone call. It was a testimony before the wrath of true authority. "Put that officer on the phone, right now." Fisher stiffened. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His hand holding the phone began to tremble, subtly at first, then visibly. All the arrogance drained from him like blood from an open vein. Who are you?" Fisher stammered. "Alexander Sterling, Attorney General of this state. And the man you just handcuffed is Federal Judge Connell Chapman, the very author of the case laws you cleverly bothered to read." This time, even Gibson took a step back, not just because the voice was thunderous, but because the very atmosphere had changed. A moment ago, Fisher had been the self-proclaimed king of Gladwin Night Patrol. Now, he was just a drenched fool gripping a phone like a blade turned against its wielder. The phone slipped from his hand, hitting the wet pavement with a soft clack. But to Fisher, the sound rang out like a prison cell slamming shut. He lowered his face. For the first time that night, he didn't laugh. He didn't speak. Only panic remained in his eyes. Connell stood tall. His eyes, behind rain-smeared glasses, were sharp as ever. And for the first time that night, he spoke with the full authority of who he truly was. "I warned you, but now it's too late. The price of arrogance. You're about to pay every cent of it." The rain was still falling, but it was no longer an ordinary rain. It had become a veil, hiding the movements of a much greater force. A storm closing in, not from nature, but from the very summit of the United States' legal system. Fisher stood frozen. The arrogance that once colored his face had vanished. Pale, shaking. As Sterling's voice thundered through the speaker, "Do you realize the man you just handcuffed is Federal Judge Connell Chapman? A judge who has served on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit for the past 18 years. You didn't just unlawfully detain a citizen. You physically assaulted a federal judge and stole his property under the authority of a police uniform. You've committed a serious crime. And the system you just insulted is going to crush you." Fisher stammered, like a man who had fallen from a throne into a pit. "No. I didn't know. I thought he was just..." "Just what?" Sterling hissed. "A black man in an old Lexus? someone unworthy of respect because he wasn't wearing a suit or parked in a mansion's driveway? Did you think the justice system was a tool for you to flaunt your power? Tonight, you're about to learn what real power looks like. The phone slipped from Fisher's hand, hitting the freezing pavement with a dull crack, like the knock of a prison cell door. His eyes widened, staring at Connell Chapman, as though truly seeing him for the first time. Not just an old black man, but a judge who had testified in 41 Senate hearings, served as legal advisor to 3 consecutive attorneys general, and was one of the most respected constitutional law scholars on the East Coast. Gibson, who had stood motionless until now, suddenly took 2 steps back. Not out of fear of being implicated, but because he realized he was witnessing a true lightning strike from the system itself, a collision between sick pride and the order built from generations of sacrifice. Connell, though still handcuffed, remained standing tall. Under the streetlight and the flashes of the phone's screen, he didn't appear as a victim. He was the living embodiment of the law rising from the shadows. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to curse. All it took was a single look, a sharp, steely glare, the same glare that had once made even seasoned prosecutors falter in federal court debates. That same glare was now fixed on Fisher, and it sent him spiraling into true panic. I'm sorry. I didn't know who you were," Fisher stammered, fumbling at his belt for the handcuff key. He tried to smile, a twisted, pitiful grin, more pathetic than threatening. Connell didn't move. "No need to unlock the cuffs," he said, his voice ice cold. "We're following protocol, and that protocol is about to become your worst nightmare." A tense silence hung like a guitar string about to snap. Then, as if summoned by an invisible force, a sound echoed in from afar. 1, then 2, then 3 vehicles. The piercing wail of tactical response sirens. Not regular patrol cars, but the unmistakable sound of the Rapid Response Unit from the office of the Pennsylvania Attorney General. Red and blue lights slashed through the rain like swords of light. Sleek black Ford Crown Victorias tore through Gladwyn's sleeping streets, jolting awake mansions lulled in midnight silence. A Chevrolet Tahoe, bearing the seal of the Department of Internal Affairs, glided in like a silent panther. Fisher backed away 3 steps, trembling. Oh God, they're coming? Gibson swallowed hard, saying nothing. But in his eyes now was a quiet reverence for the man still in cuffs, and an undisguised contempt for his fellow officer. Connell closed his eyes for a moment, not to pray, but to brace for what he knew was about to come. This was no longer a single incident. This would become a judgment declared straight into the heart of a diseased system, and it would begin right here in its darkest corner. Just 8 minutes after the call, Old Gulf Road, once a symbol of quiet, exclusive luxury for Gladwyn's elite, was transformed into a silent, yet fierce legal battlefield. Through the thin rain and the dim street lights, a convoy of vehicles approached from both ends of the street, rumbling like a declaration of war. There were 11 in total, 4 patrol cars from the Delaware County Police Department, 2 unmarked black SUVs from the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office, 3 civilian pickup trucks from the Internal Affairs Division, and 2 Chevrolet Tahoes equipped with Federal Justice Department scene monitoring technology. The flashes of red and blue police lights danced across the ivory-white walls of million-dollar mansions, reflecting through windows where a few wealthy residents had just awakened. The thick, damp mist couldn't hide the truth. True power had arrived, and it was not here to negotiate. A door of one of the Crown Victorias opened, and Alexander Sterling stepped out. He didn't need to speak. He didn't need to posture. His knee-length Burberry trench coat was lightly damp at the hem. His jet-black Italian leather shoes struck the wet pavement with low, firm thuds. His gaze was sharp, like steel forged through thousands of indignities. People called him the Sterling Storm, not because he raged, but because he punished with a cold, relentless precision that spared no one. As he stepped onto the scene, Sheriff Johnson, head of the local police force, rushed over in a panic. Heavy-set, his raincoat clung poorly to his trembling frame. His face was as pale as if he'd just witnessed a shooting. "Judge Chapman," Johnson nearly choked at the sight of the man in handcuffs, calmly standing amid the swirl of lights. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I truly didn't know you were here." Sterling didn't even turn his head. He raised a hand, a simple motion, but it cut like a blade. "Sheriff Johnson, you should go back and deal with your department before I sign an order suspending your entire station. And believe me, I've signed such orders in less than 36 hours of investigation." Johnson froze. In that moment, he understood that he wasn't just facing the wrath of a single man. This was the weight of an entire system, and it was draining the very parts he once believed untouchable. Sterling walked straight toward Connell, brushing past Gibson. The younger officer stepped back without a word. The patrol car's light illuminated Connell's face, glasses soaked with rain, one cheek swollen from hitting the car, wrists red and raw beneath the metal cuffs. "Marcus," Sterling said quietly. He rarely used first names in front of subordinates. "Are you hurt?" Connell replied gently, like the wind. "Just a few bruises, Bob. But something far more serious has been injured, and it's not on my body." Sterling nodded. Two men, a federal judge and a state attorney general, stood side by side in the dark. No flags, no speeches. Yet they were a living symbol of law and order awakening. On the other side, Douglas Fisher no longer looked defiant. He stood petrified, coat streaked with mud, face drained of color, eyes vacant. Sterling slowly turned around. His eyes locked directly on the officer. "Officer Douglas Fisher," he began, each word as sharp as a razor. "Do you understand what you've just done?" Fisher opened his mouth, about to defend himself, but his words were cut short by Sterling's voice, cold as ice. "You handcuffed a federal judge without legal cause, conducted a search without a warrant, seized personal property without a record or seal, and attempted to crush the truth under the weight of your badge. In the eyes of the law, you are no longer an officer. You are a criminal in uniform." Gibson swallowed hard. He had heard those words in classrooms, spoken by professors, but this was the first time he'd seen them delivered like a sentence, in real life. Fisher collapsed, not because of the rain, but because the things he once believed to be weapons, his gun, his cuffs, his badge, were now just evidence. And on the streets of Gladwin that night, true power had changed hands. The rain tapped steadily on the car roof, like a sorrowful drumbeat, marking the arrival of an impending end. But for those present at the scene that night, especially Douglas Fisher, it wasn't an end. It was the beginning of a chain of consequences that could never be undone. Fisher still stood there, soaked and shivering, his face pale, eyes lost. As two officers from the State Internal Affairs Division approached, he no longer resisted. One was Lieutenant Lewis Packer, a man who had investigated over 200 cases of police misconduct across the state. The other was Detective Nina Halston, sharp, precise, and unrelenting. Packer pulled a paper from the inner pocket of his raincoat, an emergency arrest warrant signed by Attorney General Sterling himself. His voice rang out, firm. "Douglas Fisher, you are under arrest for the following charges: unlawful detention, assault on a federal official, theft of personal property, and gross violation of civil rights under Title 18, Section 242 of the United States Code." Halston immediately stepped forward, firm but calm, turning Fisher's arms behind his back. No one said another word. Only the cold click of the handcuffs echoed. The same cuffs that had once violated an innocent man, now clasped tightly around the wrists of their abuser. The cuffs no longer served law enforcement. They were now a symbol of a sentence forming. Sterling, with a steady hand, gestured for the internal affairs investigator to search Fisher's jacket. "Check the left breast pocket," he said. "I want the truth revealed. Undeniable, wordless evidence." Halston reached into the pocket of Fisher's coat, where he had stashed the cash like a clumsy thief, and pulled out a stack of $2,000 in clean, dry bills, unsealed and unmarked. No evidence bag, no file tag, no incident report. The entire area fell silent. Sterling looked directly at the money and gave a single nod. "Seal it. File it under case number 6724-A. This will be primary evidence, alongside the body cam footage and direct witness testimony, to prosecute Fisher at both the state and federal level." Fisher trembled, then suddenly collapsed to his knees on the wet asphalt, kneeling before Sterling. "Please," he stammered. I have a daughter undergoing leukemia treatment. I have an unpaid mortgage. I just lost control for a moment. It was just a bad night." Sterling stared, unblinking. A man was falling apart before him, but he felt no pity. What he saw was a system betrayed by one of its sworn protectors. "Do you remember when you shoved a 60-year-old man into a car?" Sterling asked, his voice heavy. "Did you think of your daughter when you tightened those cuffs until they bled? When you stuffed the money into your pocket without recording it? When you stepped on a man's civil rights, not because of guilt, but because of bias?" Fisher sobbed, broken cries echoing through the rain. Sterling leaned down, eyes locked with his, voice slow and sharp, like hammers striking a verdict into flesh. "Mercy is a privilege, Fisher, and you are no longer worthy of it." An investigator stepped forward and removed the police badge from Fisher's chest, the badge that had once symbolized honor and trust, now stripped away like a mask fallen at the end of a cruel performance. The metal was cold in Halston's hand, but not as cold as the gaze the entire justice system now cast upon a traitor in its ranks. Connell Chapman still stood there, still in handcuffs. But in that moment, he was no longer detained. He was the witness to a public sentencing, a courtroom without walls, without jury, yet ringing with judgment in every drop of rain. And that night, on a street once known only for luxury car engines and the footsteps of the elite, a new sound emerged, the sound of justice, not merely written on paper, but enforced by truth. After Douglas Fisher was led away in handcuffs, the Gladwin neighborhood remained bathed in the flashing lights of official vehicles. Snippets of internal radio chatter drifted across encrypted frequencies, mingling with the sound of boots pressing into the wet pavement. But there was one patch of space that felt unusually still, the place where Officer Gibson stood motionless, like a statue trapped between two moments, the past of silence and the future of choice. He hadn't laid a hand on anyone, hadn't struck, hadn't stolen, hadn't abused his power. But the way he remained silent the whole time Fisher humiliated, detained, and violated an innocent man, it made him feel as though the uniform he wore no longer deserved respect. He lowered his head. The rain had thinned, but it still soaked his police shirt, clinging to his frame. Each drop that fell seemed to whisper, "You saw, and you said nothing." As Connell Chapman prepared to step into the black SUV from the Attorney General's office, the door already open, warm interior light reflecting against his glasses, he suddenly stopped, turned his head. "Gibson," he called, his voice not loud, but ringing like a summons from the bench. Gibson jolted. He looked up. His eyes were full of emotion, his throat dry. "Yes." "Your Honor?" His voice was soft as the wind, like a child caught in the act of doing wrong. Connell didn't step closer. He kept his distance, not out of anger, but because he knew. The real lesson doesn't come from comfort, but from confrontation. You saw what was wrong. You stood there, and you knew everything was wrong. But you did nothing. And that, right there, leaves you with a choice. To be made now. Gibson swallowed hard, straightened himself, but his eyes still dropped. At the time, I was afraid. He struggled for words, but his voice cracked like a wall collapsing under floodwater. Connell nodded. I don't blame you for being afraid. Fear is instinct. But if you let fear dictate your behavior, you'll become one of the thousands of officers who once saw, knew, but never spoke. And history doesn't remember those people as the good ones, but as the silent ones. That weight pressing on your heart right now, you need to hold on to it, Connell continued, his voice deep, as if delivering a final lecture to a senior law student. That feeling is your moral compass. If you let it die, you won't be a protector of justice. You'll just be someone in uniform. Gibson nodded slowly. Then, unable to hold it in, he choked out. I'll give a full statement. I'll tell everything I saw. From the very beginning. I know I owe the system. I owe you. But most of all, I owe myself. Connell looked deep into Gibson's eyes, a gaze he had seen many times during verdicts fraught with contradiction, when a defendant realized something inside them had died long ago. But this time, he saw the opposite. Something had just been born. You don't need to apologize to me, he said, emphasizing each word. Live right. Act with integrity. That's the best apology there is. A breeze swept by, cold but clean, carrying away the last remnants of silence. Gibson stood tall now, no longer unsure of himself. In his eyes was no longer the image of a judge being humiliated, but a living reminder that power only matters when it stands for truth. Connell stepped into the car. The door shut with a solid click. The vehicle pulled away from the scene. But for Gibson, what truly began to move was inside him. For the first time since donning the badge, he understood. An officer is not defined by rank, but by the moment they dare to do what's right, in a wrong time. The Ford Crown Victoria glided through the night, quietly cutting across streets that were slowly returning to calm after a storm of truth. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere wasn't heavy, but it felt weighted, like the entire justice system was sitting silently in the back seat. Connell Chapman leaned his head against the window. Outside, the rain still streamed down, like tears that had never been spoken aloud. The dim yellow light reflected off his glasses, flickering like verdicts being rewritten in the storm, inked in rain and the blood of pride. Alexander Sterling sat in the front passenger seat, silent, hands clenched on his knees. A few drops of rain still clung to the shoulders of his coat from when he had stood in the center of the scene. But in his chest, the anger had not faded, and the burden on Connell's mind only made it heavier. You know, Alex, Connell said softly, his voice no longer that of a man who had won. It was the voice of a father, a citizen, a man who had seen too many truths buried under badges and weapons. I'm not afraid of what happened to me tonight. I have a title. I have you. I have a voice. I won't lose my job, and I won't go to jail for saying something a cop didn't like. He paused briefly. His hand rested lightly on his knee, the cuff mark still visible on his wrist, like living evidence. Then his voice sank, as if whispering to his conscience. But I think about the people who don't have that voice, Alex. The black mechanic on a night shift, who just wants to get home and hug his kid before bed. The Latina college student in an old car, pulled over for a red light mistake, only to be showered with insults. The new immigrant who barely speaks English and is treated like a threat just for saying, "I don't understand." Each image he spoke became another brick in a weight pressing down on the listener. Sterling nodded slowly, eyes still on the road ahead, then turned to him. His voice was firmer now, edged with a quiet emotion too complex to name. "And that's exactly why we fight. Not just to punish someone like Fisher, but to send a clear message that a badge is not a license for abuse. It's a commitment, a promise between justice and the people." Connell closed his eyes for a brief moment. He saw his warm home, the young students who had once graduated from his lectures, and the rulings he had drafted with care down to the punctuation. But tonight, he didn't see those things as accomplishments. They felt like debts. "A night like this," he said softly, "can cost someone their job, their scholarship, their faith in the law, and worst of all, their belief in themselves." He looked at Sterling, his voice catching slightly. "We can't fix everything, but we can let someone know they are not walking through the dark alone." Sterling tightened his seatbelt, then let it go. And when enough of those small lights connect, the darkness stops being invincible. In that moment, both men, one a symbol of justice, the other the executor of state law, fell silent. Not because they had nothing more to say, but because they were carrying the voices that had never been spoken, the cases never recorded, the people never protected. The car turned onto a narrow road leading back to Villanova, the affluent neighborhood where Connell lived. But he no longer saw those grand homes the same way. They were no longer elegant limestone buildings with bronze-gated fences. Now he saw thousands of dark streets across America, where there were no flashing lights, no body cams, no attorney general showing up in 10 minutes. And he knew it was those streets where justice was needed most. Before stepping out of the car, Connell turned to Sterling and spoke, his voice soft, like a final ruling at the end of a lifetime case. "The light of justice doesn't always shine from marble buildings. Sometimes it begins with a man in handcuffs, standing upright in the rain." Something had begun to change. Join us in sharing these meaningful stories by liking and subscribing. And don't forget to hit the notification bell to start your day with deep lessons and genuine compassion.